This is a 1988 Porsche 959, and it is one of the greatest cars manufactured in the 1980s. It is also one of the all-time greatest, rarest, most valuable, and most special Porsche models in the brand's history. Porsche built only 345 of these for the entire world, and today I'm going to review this one. Thanks to Drive Coffee for making this video happen. They do ultra premium automotive inspired coffees that are roast to order, which means they roast it as soon as you order, and it's fantastic coffee. And check this out, there's even a Land Rover one inspired by the Camel Trophy. If you're a coffee drinker, check out drivecoffee.com using the link in the description below and use the discount code DOUG to get 15% off your order. And now with that said, back to the 959. And I think it's important to start off this review with a little history of this amazingly special car. Now, the 959's history is covered in greater detail elsewhere, but I'm going to provide a general overview here, and that overview starts with Group B. Now, Group B was a type of rally racing that was popular in the 1980s, and the rules of Group B said that an automaker that was competing also had to build road versions of their rally cars. Group B gave us the famous Audi Quattro, the Ford RS200, and the Lancia 037, some famous 1980s sports cars. In the early 1980s, Porsche decided that it too wanted to compete in Group B. To create a Group B rally car, Porsche needed an all-wheel drive system, since all 911 models at the time were rear-wheel drive. But Porsche didn't just want to make an all-wheel drive 911, they wanted to make an all-wheel drive supercar with tremendously complex technology and a 200-mile-an-hour top speed. They succeeded, but by the time the car finally came to market in 1986, Group B rally racing was done. It was over, and they weren't doing it anymore. As a result, Porsche decided to race the 959 in some rather varied race series, including the Paris to Dakar off-road race and the world-famous Le Mans Street Circuit race, where they competed in a racing version of the 959 called the 961. For the actual road cars, production began in 1987, and Porsche built 337 examples in two different specs. You could get the 959 Comfort, as this car is, which is by far the most common version of the 959, or you could get the 959 Sport, which was more brutal, with a few things stripped out of it to make it a little lighter and a little faster. At some point in the early 1990s, Porsche decided to build 8 more 959s with some spare parts they had laying around, bringing the total production run to 345 units. Now, the 959 was never originally sold by Porsche in the United States due to US government regulations. However, a few were imported under the show or display law, which allows certain significant cars to be imported without meeting US regulations. In fact, the show or display law was supposedly championed by a group of 959 owners who wanted to drive their 959s on US soil, reportedly including Bill Gates. Anyway, now that this car is 25 years old, it can be legally imported without having to go through the show or display law. When the 959 debuted as a production car, it was the fastest road car in the world with a top speed of 198 miles an hour. This car uses a turbocharged flat six with 444 horsepower and 369 pound-feet of torque. Values on these are climbing. This one is worth somewhere between $1.5 and $2 million. So today I'm going to take you on a tour of it, and I'm going to show you all of the quirks and features of the first modern Porsche supercar, the predecessor to the Carrera GT and the 918 Spider. Then I'm going to get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'm going to give it a Doug score. And for more of my thoughts on the 959, click the link below to visit autotrader.com/oversteer, where I've also compiled a list of the most expensive 1980s cars currently listed for sale on AutoTrader. Now I'm going to start the quirks and features of the 959 right here with the door handle. You open up the door by pulling on this little latch inside the door handle. It makes this incredibly satisfying click sound. And then once it's open, you can see in the door jamb, there is this plastic T-shaped black thing. It is a little release. When you pull it, it opens the engine cover in back. So we pull it, and now the engine cover is open, and let's go see what's going on back there. Now, interestingly, once you've pulled that release, you don't have to do anything else in order to open the engine cover. There's no second latch back here you have to open. So once you've released it, you just come back here, you lift it up, and then the engine cover is open. And there are a pair of hydraulics on either side in order to keep it open when you've opened it up so that you don't have to deal with a hood prop or anything like that. Now, once you have the engine cover open, you can take a look at the engine of the 959. This is really special. This is not something that all that many people get to see. I personally have never seen a 959 with the engine cover open until today. So take a good look. Now, this car had a couple of cool things in the engine compartment, but one thing worth mentioning is the fact that it is a twin turbocharged car. Now, this isn't all that uncommon today, and it wasn't even especially uncommon back when this car came out, but this car has sequential turbos, which means that one turbo comes on at first, and then it sort of dies off and a second turbo comes on. A lot of twin turbo cars back when this was being produced had two turbos that came on sort of later in the rev range, which meant you were getting no power, and then you got blown back in your seat. The idea with the sequential turbos was it gave you a lot more linear power delivery. Now, one interesting thing you'll notice when you look inside the engine compartment here is that the engine itself only takes up sort of the middle bit, and then there are these giant painted pieces on the sides which don't appear to have any function. Well, actually, underneath them, there is cooling systems. So that's why the engine bay is so big, even though the engine only sort of takes up the central bit. Now, one interesting item I noticed in the engine bay here is the fact that there are a couple of different warning labels that say the usual stuff, but then there's also one printed with the firing order on it. That is just a really cool looking label. You don't see that on your Toyota Camry. For our next interesting item in the engine compartment, I want to actually take you back to the body of the car, where you will notice several different flaps on the body itself. There's one behind the driver's door, there's one behind the passenger door, and then there's one on the front compartment, which is of course the trunk in this car. My entire life I have wondered what the hell these things are. Does this car have 3 fuel tanks? What is all this stuff? Finally, today I got my answer. The one behind the driver's door is for hydraulic suspension fluid. You open it with this little yellow lever here on the driver's side, pull it, and then it opens right up, and that's where you stick in the hydraulic suspension fluid. More on the suspension in a minute. You'll notice there's also a dipstick there so you can actually check the fluid level. Over on the passenger side, the little flap is for motor oil. Again, you have this little yellow lever in the engine compartment, you pull it, and then the motor oil flap opens, and you add oil. The one in the front, that's the fuel tank, but I'll get to that in a minute. For now, you will have to be satisfied with just knowing what's in these. Another thing I find rather interesting around back in this car is the brake light. You can see this car has a giant taillight that stretches across the entire rear of the car, but when you actually turn on the brake lights, these tiny little things are all that lights up back here. The rest is just a reflector. It's just for show. Next up, we move on to the wheels. Now, the wheels in the 959, to me, are some of the most distinctive wheels ever put on any car. You showed me this wheel, I could instantly, readily identify it as a 959 wheel sooner than just about any other wheel design. And I learned something rather interesting about the wheels today. Now, as you can see, there's no visible lug nuts. That's because these are center lock wheels, so they just have one giant lock in the center like race cars do and a lot of modern sports cars have. But it's not a regular center lock. So how do you take off the wheel in a 959? Well, first you take off this little cap over the hub. That's pretty standard. And then you don't just take a tool and take off the center lock. Instead, you insert the ignition key into the wheels in order to unlock them. I have never seen this before. The owner's manual goes into detail on it. Once you have put the ignition key in and unlocked the wheel, then you take the center lock tool and you can remove the wheel. I suspect that makes this the least stealable wheel in existence, since removing it is a 3-step process that involves 3 different tools, including the ignition key. But the rather weird wheels aren't the only unusual course Porsche charted with this vehicle. There are quite a few unusual items that Porsche hadn't done before. I already mentioned all-wheel drive, but there's more. For example, some of the body panels are made of Kevlar and fiberglass rather than just regular aluminum in order to save weight. And that was pretty forward thinking at the time. This car also has run-flat tires, which was a huge innovation at the time. And in fact, there's only one very specific type of Bridgestone run-flat tire that you can install on these cars even today, 30 years later. This was also the first production car to have tire pressure monitors, which the owner tells me is a total pain. He says it's a totally crazy system, and when one goes out, it's like 10 grand per tire pressure monitor in order to replace, because parts are so hard to source. And then there is the hole. Now, as you can see, if you look at this car, it looks just like a 911, but puffier. And the reason for that, of course, is because they put the all-wheel drive system in this car, and that meant there were more components in the chassis and the undercarriage, and things just had to be stretched out a little bit wider. Obviously, also the width was for stability at crazy high speed. But by making the car wider, it also gave Porsche the chance to try something new back here and put in the hole. Now, up until this time, the Porsche 911 turbo models had a wider body in the back, but they didn't have a hole. The 959's hole allows more air to flow into the engine, and this was the first time Porsche really tried this with a rear engine vehicle. The next time it appeared was on the 993 911 Turbo S, where they did the hole again, and now it is considered a staple of basically every 911 turbo. It's one of the few ways you can tell a turbo apart, because it has this hole in the fender for more air into the engine, and it started with the 959. So the other thing I like is on the passenger side window, you can see there's a little sticker in there from Blaupunkt, the manufacturer of the radio, saying, "No, you cannot steal the radio. This car has a code." This was a theft deterrent measure at the time. If you stole the radio, you needed a code to operate it. You didn't know the code, so the radio would be inoperable if you stole it. But I mean, imagine breaking in to a 959 to steal the radio. Ah, to be a youth in 1980s Germany. Next up, we climb inside the 959, where there are quite a few interesting items to share. I'm going to start with the crazy stuff, and that means starting with the transmission lever. Now, in your car, if you have a manual transmission, you have gears 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, like normal. That's how all cars are. But not this one. This car has a gear before first. It's labeled G, and that means Geland in German, which means like terrain or off-road. This car has an off-road gear. Remember I told you it did the Paris to Dakar race? Although today we think of this only as like a crazy supercar, that wasn't its sole intent. It was also intended to be kind of like an off-roader supercar, and that gear is a crawler gear designed for really low speeds to help you kind of get unstuck if you end up getting stuck somewhere off-roading in your 959. It's ridiculous. Now, that G gear is geared very short, so you're only in it for a few miles an hour before you shift into true first, although a lot of 959 owners probably start off in first, since G is such a short gear. Now, next up, you get the Paris to Dakar rally car, you get the G off-roading gear, but if you still don't believe me about this car's off-road abilities, take a look at this. Remember I mentioned the hydraulic suspension fluid? Well, this car's suspension will lift it up. The theory here is, again, if you wanted to go off-road in your 959 supercar, you would twist this little dial. You can see it has 3 different suspension heights, and then the car lifts itself up rather quickly and gets to a surprisingly high position so that it can go off-roading and tackle the trails. Remember, this car was originally built for Group B rally racing, and so it made sense at the time to have raisable suspensions so that you could go rallying in your production version as well. It's considered crazy to this day, but this car has a crawler off-road gear and adjustable suspension like a Land Rover. Now, one other amazing thing about the 959 was how adjustable this car's suspension was, beyond just going up and down, but also adjustable to different road conditions. Check this out. There's this little stalk coming off from the steering column on the right, and it allows you to change the traction mode. You can see these little lights in the gauge cluster in the far right gauge, and as you move the stalk, they adjust between 4 different traction modes. The one on the bottom, that's a sunshine, that's for dry traction, and the next one is raindrops for wet. Then above that you have a snowflake, that's ice, and then above that you have full traction, which locks the car into 4-wheel drive and makes sure there's a 50-50 torque split between the front and rear wheels permanently, so you can take your car from the Autobahn to an icy off-roading situation if you want to, You can't say that about too many other supercars. Now, when I was switching the traction modes a second ago, you may have seen these little needles in this gauge switch when I went into four-wheel drive mode. They kind of jumped up. That's because these needles show the precise power split at any given moment. The one on the left shows what percentage of the car's power is going to the rear wheels, and the one on the right shows what percentage of the car's power is going to all four wheels, and it happens in real time. It shows you exactly how much power is going to the wheels at any given moment. That is really forward thinking. But despite all of this craziness and off-road capabilities, this car also had one more suspension trick. Gives you the ability to adjust between hard and soft suspension for when you're on a racetrack and you're on the road and you're driving fast. If you want really hard suspension for best cornering, you adjust this little dial in the middle with a little shock absorber from plus to minus, and you can dial in the exact hardness or softness of the suspension depending on the type of driving you were doing. So this car has incredible off-road traction, ground clearance-y capabilities, but it also has suspension adjustment from a dial inside the car, which was way forward thinking for this time period for racetrack abilities. This car is a marvel. But anyway, next up, moving on to some of the other interesting interior quirks and features of the 959, I'm gonna start with the clock. Now you can see in the middle, there's a clock, pretty standard, but there's 3 buttons. Well, the button on the right switches it from a clock to a stopwatch, and you can use the 2 buttons on the left to start and stop the stopwatch if you're on a racetrack. Obviously, a lot of cars now have this with Chrysler performance pages and all this stuff, but here's an early timekeeping mechanism built into a car. That was pretty cool. Next up, I want to talk about some of this car's cool warning lights. The first set is above the stereo. You can see the famous Blaupunkt stereo that you can't steal. Above that, you have 3 warning lights in the middle of the dashboard. You have the ABS light. The light on the left, I'm not sure what it's for, brake pads maybe, and then the one on the right is for the parking brake. The other interesting warning item in this car is directly to the right of those warning lights, and that would be this little, it looks like a microphone thing. Well, actually, it's a buzzer. This car has this like buzzer speaker thing, and it's designed to accompany various different warning faults you can get for the tire pressure, the battery, the suspension, all kinds of different stuff. And that little speaker is where the buzzer sounds. And in the owner's manual, it goes into detail about how many seconds it buzzes for and how frequently it buzzes for, depending on which specific fault your vehicle has. Other interesting items in this car, one is the door lock. Now you can see the door lock on the door sill there, makes sense, that's pretty standard, but the strange thing is locking and unlocking the door. To do so, you twist this little knob on the door. You can see you twist it and it's locked, and then you twist it and it's unlocked, and that's a rather odd way to lock and unlock the door, but that's what they did. The other unusual locking item in this car is right in the middle between the dials for the suspension. You have the central lock button. You push it to lock and unlock the doors. Central locking was not an especially common feature in the mid-1980s, especially in sports cars like this, so that must have been a cool item to have. Now, next up, speaking of unusual locking and unlocking and entry and exit, we have the interior door handle. If you take a look at the door panel, it might be hard to even tell exactly which that is, but it's this little black plastic thing below the grab handle for the door. You pull it, and then the door opens and you can get out. Other interesting items, one is the steering wheel, which to me is one of the all-time ugliest steering wheels ever placed in any automobile in the entire history of the car. This steering wheel was also used in the 911 from this era, and it is just ridiculously heinous. It's just 2 horizontal bars, and then it says Porsche in the middle. Now in the 959, it says Porsche 959 in the middle, which makes it infinitely cooler, but it is still very ugly. Now, to activate the horn in this car, you press that middle pad in the steering wheel, and, well, here's how the horn sounds in a Porsche 959. And next up, we move on to the ashtray. Now, a quick look around the interior, you might not easily be able to locate the ashtray, but it's sort of in the bottom half of the dashboard, right in the middle. There's a little cutout, you pull it, and then the ashtray opens right up. But next up, this car has a really cool map light for if you're sitting in the driver or passenger seat and you want to read a map. Now, it's not mounted right up here on the ceiling above the mirror like it is in so many other cars. Instead, it's right over your head, and you'll notice there isn't a switch to turn it on or off. Instead, you just sort of push on the map light and it changes its direction, and depending on how it's situated, then it is either on or off. It's a pretty cool and simple way to do a map light. Now, next up, another interesting item in this car is the power seats. I say the power seats because they have a lot of different power controls over on the side, including 2 separate controls to raise or lower them, and heated seats, which is pretty advanced. The funny thing though is they're actually manual seats to move forward and backwards. There's a little lever in the front and the seat goes forward or backward manually. So some power functions, some manual functions in this seat. More interesting in the seats though is the way that they look. This car has silver leather. And does anything say 1980s more than a vehicle with silver leather? And my favorite thing is it's not just one type of silver leather. You have 3 different shades of leather, all of which are a different shade of silver. I'm not talking gray. They have like an aluminum sheen to them that makes them look silver. And this is the same in the back. The back seats also have this multi-shaded silver leather, which is just hilarious to see in a supercar in the modern era. It would never happen today. And yes, you heard me right. The back seats. The 959, just like the 911, has back seats, and so I am now going to become the only person you have ever seen climb into the back seats of a Porsche 959. Oh, the problem is that the front seat just doesn't go up far enough for any logical person to get back here, but here I am. I made it. Now, the back seats are interesting for 2 reasons. One is the fact that they are such crazy deep bucket seats. They actually look like those plastic contoured seats you see in a hot tub. There's no spreading out back here. But to me, the most interesting thing about the back seats isn't their seatiness. It's the fact that you can put them down and use this area as cargo storage if you want, just in case the front trunk isn't enough cargo space for you. The interesting thing that happens if you do that is you have to unsnap them in order to fold them down, and then if you want to fold them back up to use them as back seats, you snap them back into place. Those snaps are the only things holding the rear seat backs in place, so if you're driving around at 197 miles an hour, take comfort if you're a rear seat passenger knowing that your seat back is being held in place by a little tiny snap. But anyway, now it's time to vacate. Oh, the 959, thank God. Next up, we move on to the front of the 959, and I want to start with the little flap on the top of the front trunk, which I told you about earlier. Now that flap leads to the fuel filler. First off, let's talk about opening it. In order to open it, there's a little tiny dial to the left of the steering wheel. You have to pull on it really, really hard. There's some insider 959 info for you, and only then will the fuel flap open. Now, once it's opened, you stick the gas pump there and you can pump in fuel, but you're probably thinking, wait a minute, the trunk is up here and the fuel flap is in the trunk, so how does that work? Well, believe it or not, it works just like this. The fuel filler area is actually inside the trunk, although Porsche has gone to great lengths to make sure that the fuel doesn't like spill out and get into the trunk. You can see there's a lot of coating around it, various protective materials, but nonetheless, that's how it works in this car. In the 911, it is always on the fender, the fuel filler, but in this car, for whatever reason, they decided to stick it inside the trunk itself. Now, speaking of the trunk itself, there are quite a few unusual items inside this trunk. My favorite is if you peel back this rather thick, nice carpeting, you will see the all-time greatest warning label in automotive history, and that would be the one that lets you know that if you put the 959 on a lift, you're not supposed to put it too far back because this is a rear engine car, and so it has a lot of weight in the rear, and so it could fall backwards and the front could come up and it could fall off the lift. I wonder if that ever happened to anybody with a 959. Hopefully they saw this warning label and didn't even think of loading it that way. And then you have the labels under here, which are really cool. First off, you have the little printed label on the inside of the front trunk that shows this car's options. Now this is on the front trunk of every Porsche 911, Boxster, Cayman. You see these and you see the options, and it's kind of cool, but I've never seen one for a 959 before. And it's just so cool to see that, which is in so many other cars, but here on this $1 million limited production supercar, I suspect not many of you have seen that label for a 959. Also cool is the VIN plate itself, which is sort of at the base of the front trunk. It's this nice embossed metal rather than just a plastic little VIN plate. Also a very cool look. Finally, our last interesting item inside the front trunk is under this carpeted panel here. You pull out these little snaps that hold it in place, and then you can see that under here is the first aid kit. Now, I always make fun of first aid kits in cars, but this is the mother of all first aid kits. You open this up and there is an unbelievable amount of bandages. Look at this. Who needs this many bandages in their car? You could do a surgery in one of these things. And here's more bandages and gauze and tape and scissors. This thing is just all decked out with craziness. It's absolutely ridiculous how excessive all this stuff is. This is for if you're ever driving along in your 959 and you run across an accident where a passenger airplane ran into a school bus, then you can use your bandages and help out. Massive overkill in the 959 first aid kit. By the way, one other hilarious item about the first aid kit, if you look in the bottom of the table of contents in the first aid kit, you will see there's a space where you can write the car owner and your license plate number. It's like a little lunch pail that you're taking to first grade, and so you write your name on it because you want to make sure no one steals your Porsche 959 first aid kit, so you can make sure that you get all of the bandages to yourself at lunchtime. Next up, moving back into the 959, our final quirk is the 959 owner's manual, which is just really impressive. It's really cool. I could read this thing cover to cover and find thousands of quirks. Not only is it interesting to see an owner's manual for a 30-year-old Porsche, but also a 30-year-old limited production supercar, and everything in here is interesting. But there are several interesting items in here, most of which are at the start under a section called Points to be Noted. The Porsche 959 has been tested to the same rigorous standards as every Porsche and is fully suited to everyday driving. However, new technologies do speak a language of their own. Oh, but don't they, Porsche? The breathing of the high-performance engine with two-stage turbochargers can be audible. The engine draws in large quantity of air, blah, 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 and is no cause for concern. They were worried people would complain about hearing the air coming into the engine, and so they put in on page 6 that was nothing to worry about. Here's my favorite, though, later in Points to be Noted. The Porsche 959 is not as comfortable as a limousine. Okay, thanks, Porsche. Because the tires must be suitable for speeds in excess of 320 kilometers per hour. They are like racing tires, however, with a tread pattern. Suspension and damping have to be stiff. Ha! Good point. Do they ever? Anyway, this forward section finishes with the final words, "We wish you safe driving and a great deal of pleasure with your Porsche 959. And with that, this car went out into the ether. Now, beyond that, one interesting item I'm going to point out on page 60, they're showing you the warning lamps, and there's a little graphic of the radio in there. You can see the radio is tuned to channel 95.9, 959, 95.9. Who says that Germans don't have a sense of humor? Another great line in the 959 owner's manual, even the Porsche 959 is subject to the laws of physics. That line is even better since it's the very first item under the safety section. And one last item worth noting, it says here in the owner's manual that the top speed of this car is 315 kilometers per hour, which translates to 196 miles per hour. Now, earlier I said the top speed was 198, and that's because the sport version of the 959 could go just a little bit faster. The sport version could go a little bit faster because it had a few items removed for weight savings, namely the stereo and air conditioning. Those are the two big ones. The sport models also had a roll cage, they had sport bucket seats, and they had no passenger mirror, which the owner tells me is a telltale sign when you look at the outside of the car to instantly know if you're looking at a sport or a comfort, since most comfort owners wouldn't remove their passenger mirror to try to make their car look cooler. It's already cool enough. Okay, so those are the interesting quirks and features of the 959. Now it's time to do one of the most anxiety-provoking things I have ever done in my entire life. I'm going to drive this thing on the public roads. All right, driving the 959. This is kind of a life goal here. First thing you notice the moment you start driving, the pedals, because they're floor mounted, have a very different feel from most pedals in modern cars. It's quite unusual. The clutch is surprisingly heavy. Most Porsches from this era had nice light buttery clutches. This one is heavier than I was expecting for sure. The gear lever though feels just like a 964, 993, just wonderful, perfectly smooth, exactly how you'd expect it to. Feels just great. Now, surprisingly, there's not a ton of room. I have the seat all the way back. My knees are kind of up against the steering wheel. I'm actually surprised at how it's a little bit tight in here. Now, I'm using G as first gear, and the owner does that as well. It's a short gear, very short, shorter than a traditional first, but you can use it to drive around town, and it's no problem. car is shockingly smooth. Driving on the road here, the smoothness of the ride certainly feels as good as modern cars. I did the F40, which was sort of the competitor to this in the sense they're both cars from this era that did 200. They were the pinnacle cars, Ferrari and Porsche. The F40 is so different from this car. It's so much more brutal and angry. It's a car you'd not want to spend much time in. This car, believe it or not, I actually think you could daily it if you were insane and if you weren't worried about repair costs or anything like that. This car actually feels a lot like a 911 from this era, an 80s 911. For one thing, it looks similar. The entire dashboard setup is fairly similar, and so in that sense, you kind of feel like, oh, I'm just in a 911. Of course, then you catch a glimpse of the wing in the mirror. You look down at the steering wheel, it says 959, and you're like, oh, this is something a little bit more special. One thing I do like about the driving position is the fact that you're pretty far forward and the windshield is close to you. And so the result is that you're actually right there up against the windshield, and so there's nothing really blocking your view. You have like an amazing view out in front of you. You can feel the car, the suspension adjusting for whatever purpose to maximize its whatever, which is crazy to think about in a car from this era. The clutch engagement point is really high, so it's taking a little getting used to, although I'm kind of getting there. It doesn't feel especially weird. It's just that you kind of have to get used to the fact that the clutch isn't going to engage like in the middle of its travel, but rather at the top. The owner tells me not that many people know what it is when you drive on the street. He says a lot of people just think it's an old Porsche. And even he says he'll encounter Porsche people who don't even look twice at it, which is absolutely hilarious. Most people don't really know that this car is one of the all-time icons of the automotive industry. It's kind of funny to drive it around. You're in an F40 and everybody flips out, but you're in this thing, which is even rarer by a factor of 3. And it's like, oh, and guy's out on his Porsche. I'm flooring it here. Wow. Wow. The blow-off valve you can probably hear. Wow, it moves. That's pretty quick. One interesting thing, it doesn't feel like it has all that much until you get to about 4,000 RPM. 3,000, it's almost as if they've engineered it specifically so that you can kind of drive it around and feel normal if that's what you want to do. The steering feel is really clearly very communicative. I'm not throwing it around or anything like that, but 911s from this era were great, and this car is too. There is the tiniest amount of play in the steering wheel, just at dead center. The car does feel like it has a little bit more body roll than modern exotic cars, or certainly more than F40. Wow. Wow, 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 wow. This thing is fast. This is not a slow car. This is not 80s fast. This car is just fast. That's incredible. I can't believe that. I'm honestly surprised. I wasn't expecting it to be this fast. And you're kind of lulled into a false sense of security, because if you've driven older 911s, you're like, oh, I'm just in an older 911. And then you floor it and get into the high RPMs, and you're like, whoa, this is no older 911. And so that was the Porsche 959. This car is an absolute icon, one of the most important German sports cars ever, one of the most important Porsche models ever, and I'm so glad that I got the chance to show it to you. I'm also so glad that I had the chance to poke around it and drive it, because these cars are so rare and so rarely driven that I suspect it will be years before I even see another one of these again. But anyway, now it's time to give this car a Doug score. Starting with the weekend categories and styling, I have to admit I've never found the 959 to be beautiful. It looks dated, and it looks like a weird, bloated, puffy 911. It's still cool, but it's hardly gorgeous, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Acceleration is amazing, 0 to 60 in 3.8 seconds, which was insane at the time, and it's still impressive, and it gets an 8 out of 10. Handling is strong, though it's a bit soft in the corners, and it gets a 7 out of 10. Fun factor is high. It's a manual transmission, high-performance sports car, which is always good, but then you look in the mirror and you notice that rear fender and you remember you're in a 959. That's worth an 8 out of 10. Finally, cool factor, and few cars in the world are cooler. It's an easy 10 out of 10 for a total weekend score of 39 out of 50. Next up are the daily categories and features. The 959 doesn't have modern tech, but it does have amazing tech. I'm not sure how often you'll actually raise up the suspension, but it's still a noteworthy feature. This car was way ahead of its time in a truly amazing way, and it gets a 4 out of 10, which is impressive from a car from this era. Comfort is also impressive. It's a nice, easy ride, and if I had more room in front, it would be even higher, but it still
still gets a respectable 5 out of 10. Quality is decent. I'm sure it was the best when it debuted, but age has taken its toll on the 959, and the materials are no longer the best by modern standards. Also, the owner tells me that repairs are very expensive, and it gets a 6 out of 10. Practicality is typical of a 4-seater, 2-door car with a decent trunk, and it gets a 4 out of 10. Finally, value. These are incredibly expensive, but also iconic, and values are going up. It gets a 7 out of 10 for a total daily score of 26 out of 50. Added up, and the Doug score is 65 out of 100. And here's an interesting comparison. It merely ties the 997 Turbo, but that's a huge feat considering that 20 years separate these two cars. Better yet, check out the 959 against 1980's rivals. It destroys the Ferrari F40, though the F40 is way better in the weekend categories, but the F40 is almost impossibly difficult to use with any frequency. The 959 also beats out the Testarossa and the Countach, but of course, it can't take down the mighty Carrera GT.
Nice car. It's just an old Porsche, nothing special.